By the time Nietzsche writes on the genealogy of morals, he has already destabilized morality and beyond good and evil. He has shown that philosophy is confession, that truth is perspectival, that moral systems express psychological type. But critique is not enough. Now he wants to know, where did morality come from? Not what does morality mean, not what should morality be, but what are its origins? This shift is decisive. Genealogy is not traditional history. It is not a neutral account of events. It is a psychological excavation. Nietzsche digs beneath moral concepts to uncover the drives that produce them. He assumes something radical from the outset. Morality is not self-evident. It is not eternal. It is not grounded in divine command or rational necessity. It emerged, and what emerges can be examined. Nietzsche believes that once we trace the origin of moral values, their apparent sanctity dissolves. What looks universal reveals itself as contingent. What appears noble may reveal ignoble roots. Genealogy, therefore, strips morality of innocence. When someone says, "This is good," Nietzsche asks, according to whom, under what conditions, serving which type of life? He does not take moral language at face value. He treats it as a symptom, a surface expression of deeper forces. This method is dangerous because it bypasses moral reverence. It refuses to bow before concepts like guilt, justice, compassion, or evil. Instead, it dissects them. Why did we begin to call certain actions evil? Why did guilt become central to conscience? Why does suffering acquire moral meaning? These questions threaten the foundation of Western morality. Nietzsche does not approach them politely. He suspects that what we call moral progress may conceal psychological regression. He suspects that values celebrated as humane may originate in resentment. He suspects that guilt may be a constructed mechanism rather than a natural fact. Genealogy is therefore not an academic exercise. It is exposure. It treats morality as something grown, something shaped by struggle, power, and psychological conflict. If morality has a history, then it has a physiology. And if it has a physiology, it can be diagnosed. On the genealogy of morals is Nietzsche's diagnosis. Nietzsche begins the first essay of genealogy with a shock. Good did not originally mean morally good. It meant noble. It meant powerful, high-born, strong, life-affirming. The noble class did not ask whether they were morally justified. They simply affirmed themselves. Good described their own way of being. And what of bad? Bad meant common, ordinary, low, weak. It was not hatred. It was not moral condemnation. It was ranking. This is crucial. The noble type did not define itself in opposition to an enemy. It did not need to call anyone evil. It simply evaluated from strength. Slave morality begins differently. It begins with resentment. Those who cannot act outwardly, who are politically, physically, or socially powerless, cannot express their hostility directly. They cannot defeat the noble class in action, so they create a new battlefield, morality. Here the inversion occurs. The noble become evil. Their strength becomes cruelty. Their pride becomes arrogance. Their independence becomes wickedness. And what of the weak? The weak become good. Their suffering becomes virtue. Their humility becomes moral superiority. Their inability to retaliate becomes righteousness. This is not evolution. It is transvaluation. Nietzsche calls it the slave revolt in morality. What could not be defeated physically is defeated symbolically. The powerless gain psychological power by moralizing the strong. This is not theoretical, it is historical. Nietzsche traces it especially through Jewish and Christian moral development, where the moral categories of good and evil become absolute. Good and evil are not neutral labels, they are weapons. The shift from good-bad to good-evil marks a transformation in psychological structure. In master morality, evaluation flows outward. In slave morality, evaluation flows from wounded interiority. Slave morality cannot affirm itself directly. It must first condemn. This inversion becomes so dominant that it feels natural. We forget that good and evil have origins. We forget that they emerged from struggle. Nietzsche's purpose here is not nostalgia for aristocracy. It is exposure. He wants us to see that what feels like eternal moral truth began as a strategy of the powerless. Once this is seen, the moral vocabulary loses its innocence. Nietzsche calls it a revolt, but it is not a revolution in the streets. It is a revolution in valuation. The slave revolt in morality occurs when resentment becomes creative. This is the key word, creative. The powerless cannot act directly. They cannot discharge aggression outwardly. They cannot confront strength openly. So their hostility ferments. It waits. Eventually, it discovers a new weapon, moral language. Instead of striking the strong physically, it condemns them spiritually. It reinterprets their strength as evil. It recasts their vitality as sin. It declares their instincts corrupt. This inversion does not merely protect the weak, it empowers them. Once strength is redefined as wickedness, the weak gain moral superiority. They become judges. They stand above the noble in the new hierarchy. The battlefield has shifted from action to conscience. Nietzsche insists this was not accidental. It was strategic. The priestly class, physically weak but psychologically intense, perfected this transformation. They cultivated moral categories that reversed values entirely. Power becomes corruption. Humility becomes virtue. Obedience becomes holiness. Suffering becomes moral capital. The revolt succeeds so completely that we forget it was a revolt. Slave morality universalizes itself. It claims to speak for humanity as such. It presents its inversion as truth rather than strategy. Nietzsche does not deny that this moral system provided meaning. He does not deny its historical force. What he denies is its innocence. The slave revolt transforms resentment into a moral system. And once resentment becomes morality, it becomes self-justifying. It no longer appears reactive, it appears righteous. The weak no longer say, "We cannot retaliate." They say, "We choose not to because we are good." The psychological shift is immense. Hostility is disguised as virtue. Inhibition becomes holiness. Powerlessness becomes moral authority. This is the birth of good and evil. Nietzsche's claim is not that the weak are evil. It is that the moral system born from ressentiment reshapes the psyche of those who inhabit it. The revolt wins, but at a cost. At the center of the slave revolt stands one word: ressentiment. Nietzsche deliberately uses the French term because no single German word captures its meaning. It is not simple resentment. It is resentment that cannot discharge itself. It is hostility without outlet. When a person is injured but cannot retaliate, the reaction does not disappear. It turns inward. It waits. It reinterprets. Ressentiment is not momentary anger. It is sustained, internalized hostility. It feeds on memory. It preserves injury. It rehearses grievance. This is psychologically transformative. The noble person forgets injury quickly. Strength moves forward. Action discharges tension. The slave type cannot act, so tension accumulates. Accumulated hostility must find expression. It finds it through moral invention. Instead of saying, "I am weak," the ressentiment-driven person says, "You are evil." Instead of saying, "I cannot strike," he says, "I will not, because I am morally superior." Ressentiment, therefore, creates values reactively. It does not begin with affirmation. It begins with negation. It defines itself by what it opposes. Nietzsche is precise here. Ressentiment produces a type of morality that needs enemies. Without enemies, it cannot stabilize identity. If there is no evil to condemn, the moral self loses structure. Its virtue depends on contrast. This is why ressentiment is corrosive. It locks the individual into permanent comparison. It sustains hostility indefinitely. It transforms past injury into moral worldview. And crucially, it damages the one who carries it. Because aggression that cannot be discharged does not vanish. It internalizes. It produces tension, anxiety, suspicion. It narrows perception. The ressentiment-driven person interprets the world through injury. This is what Nietzsche means when he calls slave morality pathological. The pathology is not weakness itself. It is the psychological strategy used to compensate for weakness. Ressentiment allows the powerless to feel powerful, but only by sustaining hostility. The revolt succeeds externally. Internally, it poisons. The slave revolt succeeds because it shifts the arena of power. If power is defined physically, the weak lose. If power is defined morally, the weak can win. This is the genius and the danger of slave morality. Once strength is redefined as evil and weakness as virtue, the powerless acquire moral authority. They become judges. They dictate the standards by which others are evaluated. The battlefield moves from action to conscience. The priestly type plays a central role here. Unlike the noble warrior, the priest cannot dominate through force, but he possesses psychological acuity. He understands guilt, he understands memory, he understands how to shape interpretation. He reframes suffering as proof of righteousness. He reframes power as corruption. He reframes humility as holiness. Through this reframing, he conquers spiritually what he could not conquer physically. The noble type values strength directly. The priest values influence indirectly. And influence can become more enduring than force. This is why slave morality does not remain marginal. It spreads, it universalizes. It becomes the dominant moral framework of Western civilization. But Nietzsche insists on something uncomfortable. The weak do not simply protect themselves through morality. They gain control over valuation itself. Once moral categories are internalized, individuals begin policing themselves. The priest no longer needs chains. Guilt does the work. The weak become morally powerful because they redefine the criteria of power. Power becomes suspect. Excellence becomes arrogance. Distance becomes cruelty. Instinct becomes sin. This inversion stabilizes the weak, but at a cost. It does not strengthen them physically. It does not increase vitality. It gives them moral leverage. And this leverage depends on sustaining the very condition that produced it. The system cannot afford to eliminate ressentiment entirely. It must preserve grievance to maintain moral authority. This is where pathology deepens. Slave morality triumphs, but it builds a culture structured around hostility toward strength. Nietzsche does not romanticize domination. He exposes inversion. The weak become morally powerful by redefining the game. And once the game is moralized, everyone must play. If ressentiment externalizes hostility through moral condemnation, the next development internalizes it. This is the birth of bad conscience. Nietzsche asks a new question. What happens when human beings are forced into civilization? Early humans were not inward creatures. They were instinctual, aggressive, immediate. When anger arose, it discharged. When conflict appeared, it was enacted. But civilization restrains instinct. Social order requires the inhibition of aggression. Violence must be controlled. Impulse must be regulated. Drives must be redirected. The instincts do not disappear. They turn inward. This is the decisive psychological shift. The aggressive energies once directed outward now attack the self. Cruelty, which once found external targets, becomes self-cruelty. Bad conscience is not natural guilt. It is redirected aggression. Human beings begin to judge themselves. They internalize surveillance. They monitor desire. They punish themselves mentally. This produces interiority, depth, reflection, memory. Nietzsche does not deny that this development creates complexity. It produces art, law, culture, but it also produces tension. The human animal becomes divided against itself. Instinct says one thing, morality says another. The aggression that cannot be expressed outwardly becomes anxiety, shame, and self-accusation. This is the foundation of guilt. Nietzsche insists that guilt did not originate as moral failure before God. It began as a relationship of debt. One owed something, one failed to pay. Punishment followed. Over time, this external structure became internalized. The feeling of indebtedness transformed into moral guilt. Bad conscience is therefore not evidence of moral enlightenment. It is the psychological cost of civilization. It intensifies self-awareness. It deepens memory. It produces interior conflict. But it also turns life against itself. Where the noble type moved outward, the civilized human turns inward. And once aggression is internalized, it requires new meaning. That meaning will be provided by the ascetic ideal. Nietzsche now traces guilt to something concrete and unsentimental: debt. In early societies, punishment had nothing to do with moral evil. It was transactional. If someone caused harm, they owed compensation. If they failed to repay, punishment followed. Pain was a form of repayment. The relationship was economic, not moral, creditor and debtor. Punishment was not about inner corruption. It was about balance. Over time, however, this external structure became internalized. The language of debt migrated into the psyche. Obligation became moralized. One did not merely owe compensation, one owed obedience. One owed loyalty, one owed reverence. The idea of debt deepened. Eventually, under religious development, especially in Christianity, the concept of debt expanded infinitely. Humanity became indebted to God. The debt was unpayable. This is where guilt becomes metaphysical. The individual is no longer merely responsible for actions. He is fundamentally guilty. His very existence is marked by indebtedness. Nietzsche sees this as a profound psychological intensification of bad conscience. What began as a practical system of repayment becomes an internal condition of permanent self-accusation. Punishment shifts from external enforcement to internal torment. The individual punishes himself through shame. He monitors his thoughts. He suspects his instincts. He interprets suffering as deserved. The creditor has moved inside. This internalization creates a self that is constantly observed, judged, and corrected. Nietzsche does not deny that this produces depth. It creates responsibility. It creates memory. It stabilizes social order. But it also produces a human being who experiences himself as flawed at the core. Guilt becomes identity. And once guilt becomes identity, life is interpreted through failure. The system sustains itself by intensifying self-surveillance. The individual becomes both debtor and punisher. This is not moral progress in Nietzsche's account. It is a psychological transformation born of restraint and power dynamics. The question is not whether guilt exists. The question is what it costs. By this point in Nietzsche's account, something decisive has happened. The human being has become divided. Instinct has been restrained. Aggression has been internalized. Debt has become metaphysical. Punishment has moved inward. What emerges is the guilty self. This self does not merely commit wrong acts. It experiences itself as wrong. Nietzsche insists that this is historically constructed. The guilty self is not an eternal psychological structure. It is the result of centuries of internalization. A creature once driven outward now turns inward with suspicion. Conscience becomes self-surveillance. The individual watches his own thoughts. He distrusts his own impulses. He interprets desire as potential corruption. He experiences suffering not as misfortune, but as deserved. This is a new depth of interiority. Nietzsche acknowledges that it produces remarkable developments: introspection, artistic sensitivity, self-reflection. But he refuses to romanticize it, because this depth comes at a price. Aggression that cannot be expressed outwardly becomes self-accusation. Power that cannot be exercised externally becomes self-discipline. Cruelty that cannot strike others becomes self-cruelty. The guilty self learns to interpret instinct as sin. Over time, this becomes normalized. People forget that the guilty self is historical. They treat it as natural. They assume that conscience is evidence of moral progress. Nietzsche disagrees. He sees in the guilty self a tension that can intensify creativity. but also intensify pathology. The self becomes a battlefield. One part accuses, another part defends, another part judges. The unified, outward-moving organism is replaced by an internally fractured one. This fracture makes higher culture possible. It also makes neurosis possible. Nietzsche's point is not that civilization should be undone. It is that we must understand what it has produced. The guilty self is not sacred. It is engineered. And once engineered, it can be evaluated. Does this structure enhance life, or does it perpetuate self-hostility? The answer is not simple, but the diagnosis is clear. The human being has learned to turn against himself. Nietzsche now uses language that unsettles modern readers. He calls certain moral developments sick. This is not metaphorical insult, it is diagnostic language. If aggression is internalized permanently, if instinct is reinterpreted as guilt, if self-surveillance becomes constant, the organism begins to function against itself. Life turns hostile toward life. The guilty self does not merely regulate behavior, it condemns desire, it mistrusts vitality, it experiences strength as temptation. This produces a chronic condition. The individual feels indebted, flawed, unworthy. Even in the absence of concrete wrongdoing, the moral framework demands confession, repentance, self-examination. The internal creditor never fully releases the debtor. Nietzsche sees this as structurally unstable. An organism that directs its force inward indefinitely creates tension without resolution. The aggression that once strengthened survival now corrodes internally. This corrosion produces anxiety, depression, and ressentiment. And here the two strands of genealogy converge. Ressentiment externalizes hostility through moral condemnation. Bad conscience internalizes hostility through guilt. Together they create a culture structured around accusation, outward and inward. The system preserves order, but at a cost to vitality. Nietzsche does not deny that this moral structure enabled social cohesion. He acknowledges its historical power, but he insists that the long-term effect is weakening. An organism that cannot affirm its instincts becomes hesitant. A culture that teaches suspicion of strength suppresses excellence. Pathology, for Nietzsche, means life turned against its own flourishing. It does not mean immorality, it means self-hostility embedded in moral form. This is the brutal clarity of his diagnosis. The moral system born from resentment and internalized aggression may stabilize society, but it leaves individuals fractured, and fractured organisms struggle to create. The third essay of Genealogy introduces the final piece of the structure, the ascetic ideal. If bad conscience creates inner tension and ressentiment creates moral hostility, the ascetic ideal gives both a purpose. The ascetic ideal tells the suffering person, your pain has meaning, not accidental meaning, not tragic meaning, moral meaning. Suffering becomes proof of virtue, denial becomes purity, weakness becomes spiritual superiority. The ascetic priest does not eliminate suffering, he interprets it. He tells the sick that their sickness is not failure, it is evidence of higher worth. He tells the guilty that their guilt is justified, but redeemable through obedience and humility. This gives relief. Meaning is powerful. If suffering can be explained as divine test, moral purification, or spiritual discipline, it becomes bearable. The ascetic ideal therefore preserves the sick. Nietzsche is careful here. He does not accuse the ascetic priest of conscious deception. The priest may believe his own doctrine, but structurally the ideal functions to stabilize resentment and bad conscience. It transforms hostility inward into self-denial. It transforms guilt into ritual. It transforms weakness into moral authority. Most importantly, it prevents collapse. Without meaning, suffering produces nihilism. With the ascetic ideal, suffering produces identity. The will does not disappear, it shifts. If one cannot will power outwardly, one can will self-denial. If one cannot create, one can renounce. Nietzsche's devastating line is this: the ascetic ideal expresses a will to nothingness. Better to will nothing than not will at all. The ascetic ideal preserves life by diminishing it. It prevents despair by reinterpreting weakness as purpose. This is psychologically brilliant and biologically costly. It sustains culture but suppresses vitality. Nietzsche does not deny that the ascetic ideal has power. He asks what kind of power it is. The ascetic priest does not cure suffering, he manages it. When individuals experience inattention, guilt, resentment, inhibition, they risk collapsing into despair. The ascetic ideal steps in and reframes that tension as meaningful. Your suffering is not pointless. Your weakness is not failure. Your self-denial is noble. This interpretation stabilizes the psyche, but it does so by preserving the very conditions that produce the suffering. Instead of asking whether guilt is pathological, the ascetic ideal intensifies it. Instead of dissolving ressentiment, it sanctifies it. Instead of encouraging the reorganization of drives, it promotes suppression. It keeps the sick alive, but not healthy. Nietzsche calls this a paradoxical triumph. The ascetic ideal prevents nihilism. It gives direction to those who would otherwise collapse. But the direction it gives is negative. It channels the will toward self-denial. The will is not eliminated. It is redirected toward renunciation. This is what Nietzsche means when he says that the ascetic ideal represents a will to nothingness. Better to will the denial of life than to confront the absence of meaning. The priest, therefore, becomes indispensable in a culture structured around bad conscience. He gives interpretation to suffering. He turns internal hostility into moral practice. Confession, penance, discipline. These rituals stabilize fractured selves. But stability is not vitality. The ascetic ideal creates order within sickness. It does not restore health. Nietzsche's critique is not that compassion is evil. It is that institutionalized pity can perpetuate weakness by protecting it from transformation. The ascetic ideal preserves life, but in diminished form. It protects the herd from despair. It protects ressentiment from collapse. It protects bad conscience from self-destruction. In doing so, it entrenches pathology. Nietzsche ends Genealogy with a stark claim. The ascetic ideal expresses not the absence of will, but a will to nothingness. This is crucial. Human beings cannot endure the absence of meaning. When suffering loses interpretation, nihilism emerges. The world appears pointless. Values dissolve. Motivation collapses. The ascetic ideal prevents this collapse. It gives suffering a framework. It says your pain is purposeful, your denial is righteous, your weakness is spiritually elevated. But what is being willed in this structure? Not expansion, not strength, not creative transformation. It is the negation of life. The ascetic ideal directs the will toward suppression of instinct, suppression of desire, suppression of vitality. It channels energy into renunciation. Better to will nothingness than to will nothing at all. This is Nietzsche's terrifying clarity. The moral systems that grew from ressentiment and bad conscience do not eliminate the will. They redirect it away from affirmation and toward denial. The will persists, but it becomes self-destructive. This is nihilism in slow motion, not open chaos, not explicit rejection of value, but a culture that treats life itself as something to be corrected, purified, or restrained. Nietzsche's concern is not theological, it is physiological. A culture that systematically mistrusts strength, sanctifies weakness, and interprets suffering as moral proof may survive, but it does not flourish. The ascetic ideal prevents despair by institutionalizing decline. It saves humanity from collapse, while exhausting its vitality. On the Genealogy of Morals, therefore, does not simply criticize morality. It exposes its psychological mechanics. Slave morality arises from ressentiment. Bad conscience arises from internalized aggression. The ascetic ideal gives both structure and endurance. Together they create a civilization capable of deep introspection and deep self-hostility. Nietzsche does not offer easy consolation at the end. He does not propose immediate replacement. He leaves us with a question. If our highest values grew from sickness, what would values born from strength look like? That question opens the path forward.